Imagine standing on a windswept coast in the early 1600s. Before you, the gray waves of the Atlantic crash endlessly against the cliffs, stretching toward distant lands. Behind you, a small island kingdom, fractured, ambitious, and restless, is preparing to cast its gaze outward. No one could have guessed that this damp, rain-soaked realm would one day rule over a quarter of the world's land and population. From the bustling streets of London to the spice markets of India, from Caribbean sugar plantations to Australian penal colonies, the British Empire would reshape the map of the world. But empires are not born overnight. They're built through centuries of ambition, conflict, commerce, and coercion. The British Empire's story is not simply one of conquest. It is a tale of merchants and monarchs, of ships and soldiers, of revolts and rebellions, of ideals and hypocrisies. It is a history where glory and brutality walk side by side, leaving legacies that still shape our present. In this long journey, we'll trace the empire from its medieval beginnings to its global supremacy, through crises, wars, and eventual decline. We'll examine the machinery that powered it, the people who lived under it, and the ideas that justified it. By the end, you may see the familiar outlines of British history in an entirely new way, not as a straight line, but as a complex web of ambitions and consequences. So settle in. We are about to embark on a voyage that spans oceans and centuries, a voyage through the entire history of the British Empire. Before the Empire, England in the medieval world. To understand how Britain built a global empire, we must begin in a time when it was not a global power at all. In the medieval era, England was just one kingdom among many in Europe, often more concerned with its own neighbors than distant continents. The Norman conquest of 1066 had tied England's ruling elite to France, making it a continental power more than a maritime one. For centuries, English kings spent their resources and attention on wars in France, dynastic disputes, and defending their borders from Scotland and Wales. There was little thought of overseas expansion. The seas were dangerous, and the idea of empire was still bound to the Mediterranean world of Rome and Byzantium. The medieval English economy revolved around agriculture, wool, and feudal obligations, not global trade. London was a growing city, but compared to Venice, Genoa, or the bustling Islamic cities of the Middle East, it was provincial. English merchants traded mainly with Northern Europe through the Hanseatic League, shipping wool to Flanders in exchange for fine cloth. The crown had little centralized control over trade or exploration. Private merchants and guilds dominated commerce. Naval technology was modest, small ships, mostly used for coastal trade and fishing. The grand vision of transoceanic voyages was still far in the future, but seeds of change were already being sown. The Crusades had opened up new trade routes and brought luxury goods from the East to Europe. The Black Death in the 14th century, while devastating, began to loosen the rigid bonds of feudalism and created a more mobile and commercial society. The Hundred Years' War, 1337 to 1453, taught England hard lessons about military logistics, centralized authority, and national identity. By the time the Middle Ages gave way to the Renaissance, England was beginning to look outward, slowly shifting its focus from the European continent to the wider world. One often overlooked factor was the sea itself. England's geographic isolation forced it to rely on maritime routes for security and trade. As continental ambitions faltered, attention gradually turned to the Atlantic. Fishing expeditions pushed further west, toward Newfoundland. Pirates and private traders roamed the seas, sometimes sanctioned by the crown. Maritime laws, ship designs, and navigation techniques improved. By the 15th century, the conditions were quietly forming for England to become a naval power, though few yet imagined it would rival Spain or Portugal. This medieval backdrop is crucial because it shows that the British Empire was not inevitable. It emerged from a specific historical moment where internal transformation met external opportunity. A kingdom once defined by feudal lords and wool markets would within 2 centuries begin to command fleets and colonies across the globe. The Tudor vision, naval power, and ambition. The rise of the Tudor dynasty in 1485 marked a decisive turning point. Henry VII and his son Henry VIII inherited a country exhausted by civil war, the Wars of the Roses, but ripe for centralization. They built a stronger monarchy, one capable of funding ships, regulating trade, and asserting authority over the seas. Henry VII cautiously encouraged exploration, sponsoring voyages like John Cabot's 1497 expedition to Newfoundland, which laid England's first claim to lands in the New World. These early efforts were small, but they signaled a shift. England was beginning to think beyond its shores. Henry VIII, though remembered for his wives and religious upheavals, also modernized England's navy. He invested in shipbuilding, built dockyards, and created a permanent fleet. Massive warships like the Mary Rose showcased England's growing maritime ambitions. For the first time, England was not merely defending its coasts, it was preparing to project power. Naval bureaucracy improved, cannons were standardized, and coastal defenses were strengthened. These reforms laid the institutional foundation that future explorers and privateers would rely upon. But it was under Elizabeth I, 1558 to 1603, that this naval vision matured. The Reformation had broken England away from Catholic Europe, making it a religious and political outsider. Spain and Portugal dominated the New World, claiming vast territories through papal decrees. England, excluded from these arrangements, had to find its own path. Elizabeth's reign was marked by cautious diplomacy but daring maritime ventures. She gave licenses to privateers like Francis Drake and John Hawkins, who combined exploration, trade, and piracy. English ships began to circle the globe, challenge Spanish treasure fleets, and establish networks of intelligence and profit. Elizabeth's England did not yet possess a formal empire, but it had something almost more important: an imperial mindset. It was willing to take risks on the sea, to use trade and private enterprise as tools of expansion, and to challenge established powers. The defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588, though partly due to weather, cemented England's reputation as a naval power to be reckoned with. The stage was now set for systematic overseas ventures, laying the groundwork for colonization, chartered companies, and imperial rivalry. Elizabethan sea dogs, pirates, privateers, and profit. By the late 16th century, England was no longer content to watch Spain and Portugal divide the world between them. Under Queen Elizabeth I, a new breed of adventurer emerged, men who blurred the lines between piracy, exploration, and state service. These were the Elizabethan sea dogs, figures like Francis Drake, John Hawkins, and Walter Raleigh, whose exploits would become legend. They sailed not under imperial charters, but letters of marque, legal documents that gave them permission to plunder enemy ships during wartime. In practice, this meant raiding Spanish treasure fleets, disrupting colonial supply lines, and returning home with unimaginable wealth. These privateers became national heroes. Francis Drake's circumnavigation of the globe between 1577 and 1580, the first Englishman to do so, returned with Spanish gold and spices worth millions in today's terms. He was knighted aboard his ship by Elizabeth herself. Hawkins pioneered the English role in the transatlantic slave trade, capturing and selling enslaved Africans to Spanish colonies despite official bans. Raleigh sponsored expeditions to North America, famously attempting to establish the Roanoke colony, a mysterious settlement that vanished without a trace. For these men, imperial expansion was as much about private profit as national glory. But their actions had broader geopolitical consequences. Spanish imperial power depended on vast flows of silver from the Americas. When English privateers attacked treasure ships in ports in the Caribbean and Pacific, they struck at the economic heart of Spain's empire. Tensions escalated, leading to open conflict with the Spanish Armada in 1588. The Armada's defeat wasn't just a naval victory, it was a psychological shift. For the first time, England had challenged and humbled the greatest power of the age. Equally significant was the maritime culture these privateers cultivated. They mapped new coastlines, experimented with ship designs, and brought home knowledge of winds, currents, and routes. Their ventures encouraged investment from London's merchants, paving the way for future joint stock companies. While they weren't empire builders in the modern sense, they laid the groundwork for England's global expansion by proving that its ships could go anywhere and return with riches. The birth of the East India Company. On the last day of the 16th century, the 31st of December, 1600, I granted a royal charter to the Company of Merchants of London trading into the East Indies. Known simply as the East India Company, EIC, would grow from a group of ambitious traders into a force that ruled millions. The charter gave the company a monopoly on English trade east of the Cape of Good Hope. At first, its goal was simple: Break into the spice trade, dominated by the Portuguese and Dutch. The EIC was revolutionary in structure. Instead of relying on royal funding, it was financed by joint stock investment, meaning merchants pooled capital for shared ventures and profits. This model allowed for larger, riskier expeditions than any one individual could afford. Its early voyages were fraught with danger, storms, disease, and fierce competition from the well-established Dutch East India Company (VOC). But the English persisted, slowly establishing footholds along India's coasts and negotiating with Mughal emperors for trade rights. What set the company apart was its blend of commerce and sovereignty. It built fortified trading posts, minted its own coins, maintained private armies, and acted as a diplomatic agent. Factories trading outposts like Surat, Madras, Bombay, and Calcutta became the embryos of empire. Unlike the Crown, which lacked funds for colonial expansion, the EIC could act swiftly and ruthlessly. Its ships brought home spices, silks, cotton, and eventually tea, enriching London's markets and filling royal coffers through taxes and duties. The creation of the East India Company marked a new stage in English imperialism, not conquest by armies, but by merchants, investors, and accountants. Its activities in Asia would, over the coming centuries, transform from trade into outright rule. What began as a commercial enterprise would eventually become the backbone of the British Empire in the East. Early colonies in North America and the Caribbean. While the East India Company pushed eastward, English adventurers also turned their eyes westward, to the Americas. In 1607, the Virginia Company established Jamestown, the first permanent English settlement in North America. It was a precarious venture. Disease, famine, and conflict with indigenous peoples nearly destroyed it. But with the introduction of tobacco cultivation, the colony found profitability. Tobacco exports boomed, and soon planters demanded more land and more labor. To meet this demand, the English imported indentured servants, poor Europeans who worked for years in exchange for passage, and increasingly enslaved Africans. The Caribbean, meanwhile, became the true economic engine. Colonies like Barbados, Jamaica, and Antigua were transformed into sugar-producing powerhouses. The wealth generated by sugar dwarfed that of tobacco or furs. But it came at a horrific cost. Brutal plantation regimes and the mass importation of enslaved Africans through the Atlantic slave trade, in which English ships played a central role. Unlike the Spanish, who ruled vast centralized empires, the English colonies developed decentralized structures. Private companies, colonial assemblies, and self-governing charters allowed settlers a degree of autonomy. This fostered innovation and expansion, but also set the stage for future tensions with the Crown. Meanwhile, maritime trade routes linking England, Africa, and the Americas created the infamous triangular trade: manufactured goods from England to Africa, enslaved people from Africa to the Americas, and sugar and tobacco back to England. By the mid-17th century, England had planted a network of colonies stretching from Newfoundland to the Caribbean, and these were not yet parts of a grand imperial plan. They were patchwork ventures driven by merchants, adventurers, and planters. But they proved remarkably resilient, laying the foundation for a colonial system that would expand explosively in the centuries to come. The Stuart period and imperial competition. The accession of the Stuart dynasty in 1603 brought new ambitions and new challenges. James I and Charles I presided over a kingdom still experimenting with overseas expansion, but now facing intense European competition. The Dutch, flush with wealth from their VOC, dominated Asian trade. The French were establishing their own colonies in Canada and the Caribbean. Spain remained powerful, though increasingly stretched thin. England had to compete in multiple arenas simultaneously, economically, militarily, and diplomatically. Under the Stuarts, the state's role in empire expanded. Royal charters were issued to companies like the Hudson's Bay Company 1670, which gained control over vast fur trading territories in North America. The Navigation Acts beginning in 1651 sought to regulate colonial trade, ensuring that English goods were carried on English ships. This reflected the growing ideology of mercantilism, the belief that national wealth and power depended on controlling trade and accumulating bullion. But the Stuart era was also one of political turmoil at home. The English Civil War, 1642 to 1651, the execution of Charles I, and the subsequent Commonwealth under Oliver Cromwell disrupted imperial administration, but also spurred new ventures. Cromwell's regime seized Jamaica from the Spanish in 1655, beginning a long period of English Caribbean dominance. Naval reforms under the Commonwealth laid the foundation for England's future global navy, making it a formidable rival to the Dutch. By the restoration of Charles II in 1660, England was emerging as a true imperial contender. It had colonies in the Americas, trading posts in Asia, and a navy capable of challenging European rivals. Though still fragmented and often driven by private interests, its overseas network was beginning to take cohesive shape. The age of scattered ventures was giving way to an era of systematic expansion, and with it, global rivalry. Mercantilism and the rise of trade empires. In the 17th century, a powerful economic philosophy took hold of Europe: mercantilism. Under this doctrine, a nation's wealth and power were measured not by land, but by the amount of gold and silver it possessed. The world was seen as a zero-sum game. If one nation gained, another must lose. For England, this meant the state should maximize exports, minimize imports, and control colonial trade to enrich the mother country. It was this mindset that transformed England's scattered colonial holdings into instruments of national strategy. To implement mercantilist policies, the English Crown and Parliament passed a series of navigation acts. Beginning in 1651, these laws required that all colonial goods be carried on English ships and routed through English ports before reaching foreign markets. The idea was simple, but powerful. Colonies existed to supply raw materials to England and to serve as captive markets for English manufactured goods. Timber, sugar, tobacco, and cotton flowed into English harbors. Textiles, tools, and finished products flowed out. The Navigation Acts not only enriched England, but also spurred the growth of its maritime industries. Shipbuilding boomed in places like London and Bristol. Merchants and investors poured capital into overseas ventures. Ports became bustling centers of global commerce, and London emerged as the commercial heart of Europe. By tightly controlling trade routes, England reduced its reliance on foreign shipping and cut into the profits of Dutch merchants who had previously dominated global commerce. But mercantilism also created friction and tension. Colonists chafed under restrictions that prevented them from freely trading with other nations. Smuggling became rampant in the American colonies, where merchants sought better prices from French, Spanish, or Dutch traders. Rival powers, especially the Dutch, resented England's attempts to control the seas. These tensions would erupt into wars, but they also solidified England's transition from a peripheral kingdom to a trade-centered empire, one whose power rested on commerce, not conquest alone. Wars with the Dutch, rivalry on the high seas. If mercantilism was the economic engine, naval warfare with the Dutch Republic was the crucible in which England's maritime empire was forged. In the mid-17th century, the Dutch were the undisputed masters of global trade. Their merchant fleet was larger than those of all other European powers combined. Dutch ships carried spices from Indonesia, sugar from Brazil, and goods from every corner of the known world. For England to rise, the Dutch had to be challenged. The First Anglo-Dutch War 1605–1654, fought under Oliver Cromwell's Commonwealth, was triggered by disputes over the Navigation Acts. English attempts to search Dutch ships for compliance turned skirmishes into full-scale battles. Though the war ended indecisively, it was a sign of England's growing naval ambition. The Second 1665–1667 and Third 1672–1674 Anglo-Dutch wars under the restored Stuart monarchy were far more intense. These conflicts saw epic naval battles between fleets commanded by figures like Admiral Robert Blake for England and Mitchell de Ruyter for the Dutch. The wars were fought not just in European waters but across colonial outposts in Africa, Asia, and the Americas. Forts and trading posts changed hands repeatedly. While the Dutch often prevailed at sea, the wars strained their economy and disrupted their trade networks. England, meanwhile, gained critical footholds, including New Amsterdam, captured in 1664 and renamed New York. Though neither side achieved total victory, the wars signaled a power shift. By the late 17th century, the Dutch Golden Age was waning, and England's naval power was ascendant. These wars were not merely military clashes, they were battles for global commercial supremacy, and England emerged the stronger. colonizing the Caribbean, sugar, slavery, and wealth. While battles raged with the Dutch, England expanded aggressively in the Caribbean. It's an archipelago that would become the economic engine of its early empire. Colonies like Barbados, Jamaica, and Antigua were transformed from modest outposts into some of the most profitable territories in the world. The key was sugar. By the late 17th century, sugar was no longer a luxury, but a mass-consumed commodity in Europe, driving insatiable demand. To maximize sugar production, planters turned to large-scale plantation systems. At first, they relied on indentured European laborers. But as death rates soared and demand grew, they turned increasingly to the transatlantic slave trade. English ships transported millions of enslaved Africans to the Caribbean, where they were forced to labor under brutal conditions. Mortality rates were staggering. Plantations became sites of unimaginable suffering, yet the profits were immense. The sugar economy reshaped England's relationship with its colonies. Unlike North America, where settlers sought land and autonomy, the Caribbean colonies were fully integrated into imperial commerce. Wealthy absentee planters lived in England, while overseers managed vast estates abroad. Sugar profits enriched the treasury through taxes, financed wars, and fueled the rise of powerful merchant elites in London and Bristol. The Caribbean also became a strategic military theater. Fortresses, naval bases, and pirate havens dotted the islands. Control of key territories like Jamaica allowed England to project power deep into Spanish waters, threatening their treasure fleets. By 1700, the Caribbean had become the beating heart of England's imperial economy, built on sugar, maintained by ships, and underpinned by slavery. British India, early footsteps on the subcontinent. While the Caribbean generated wealth, the Indian subcontinent represented something even more profound, a gateway to Asian riches. Initially, the English East India Company was just one player among many, competing with Portuguese, Dutch, and French traders. It secured permission from the Mughal Empire, then, at its height under emperors like Akbar and Jahangir, to establish trading posts at Surat, Madras, Bombay, and Calcutta. The company's presence was carefully negotiated. The Mughals were powerful and sophisticated. The English were merely guests in their empire, paying customs duties and respecting local authority. What made the EIC different was its long-term patience and strategic planning. Rather than conquering territory outright, it embedded itself economically, controlling shipping, pricing, and distribution of lucrative commodities like textiles, indigo, and pepper. As Mughal authority began to fragment in the late 17th century, the company quietly expanded its influence. It fortified its settlements, built private armies, and acted increasingly like a sovereign power. Conflicts with rival European powers, especially the French, turned India into a theater of imperial competition. The seeds of future British dominance were being sown not through conquest, but through contracts, trade, and diplomacy. By the dawn of the 18th century, the East India Company was no longer just a trading entity. It had become a political actor, capable of shaping events on the subcontinent. What began as humble trading posts would eventually grow into the jewel of the British Empire. But for now, it remained a growing presence, waiting for the right historical moment to seize power. Africa and the slave trade, commerce and cruelty. By the late 17th century, Africa became a cornerstone of British imperial commerce, not for territorial conquest, but for human lives. The British Empire, like its European rivals, dove headlong into the transatlantic slave trade, a system that would shape the economy, society, and moral legacy of the empire for centuries. British merchants established fortified trading posts along the West African coast, places like Cape Coast, Castle, and Bunce Island, where they negotiated with local rulers, often through force, deceit, or unequal alliances, to purchase captives. Enslaved Africans were packed onto ships in brutal conditions for the Middle Passage, the voyage across the Atlantic to the Caribbean and the Americas. Disease, starvation, and abuse claimed countless lives. Survivors were sold in bustling slave markets and sent to plantations to work in sugar, tobacco, and cotton fields. By the 18th century, Britain had become the largest slave-trading nation in the world, transporting nearly half of all Africans forcibly taken across the Atlantic. The profits were staggering. Liverpool, Bristol, and London flourished on the back of the trade. Merchants built opulent houses, banks rose to power, and industries like shipbuilding and insurance grew around this inhuman commerce. Even institutions like universities and charitable foundations were funded by slave-derived wealth. But it was not just an economic system, it was an imperial machine. The slave trade linked Africa, the Americas, and Britain in a triangular system: slaves to the colonies, raw materials to Britain, manufactured goods to Africa. This system provided the financial fuel for Britain's imperial ambitions elsewhere. It also entrenched a racialized hierarchy, shaping attitudes that would persist far beyond the abolition of slavery. The British Empire's global expansion cannot be understood without confronting this brutal chapter, a chapter of commerce built on cruelty. Scientific voyages and Pacific exploration. While profits flowed from Africa and the Caribbean, the 18th century also saw a new kind of imperial expansion: voyages of discovery. Backed by the Royal Navy and scientific institutions like the Royal Society, Britain began to send explorers, cartographers, naturalists to chart the unknown corners of the globe. These voyages combined imperial ambition with Enlightenment curiosity, blending science and strategy in ways that would redefine global geography. The most famous figure of this era was Captain James Cook, whose 3 expeditions, 1768 to 1779, mapped vast stretches of the Pacific. His first voyage, aboard the HMS Endeavour, was officially to observe the transit of Venus, but secretly. Cook carried sealed orders to search for the fabled Terra Australis Incognita, the unknown southern land. He charted New Zealand's coastline, claimed Eastern Australia for Britain, and laid the groundwork for future colonization. These voyages were not mere adventures. They mapped strategic territories, collected botanical specimens, documented indigenous cultures, and assessed the military and commercial potential of distant lands. Naturalists like Joseph Banks returned to Britain with vast collections of plants and animals, knowledge that fueled the scientific revolution and agricultural innovation. Pacific exploration also had imperial consequences. By mapping coastlines and identifying anchorages, Britain created the blueprints for later colonial expansion in Oceania. These voyages demonstrated the global reach of the Royal Navy, projecting British power to places no other European empire had systematically explored. The age of exploration was not over. It had simply become an imperial instrument. The 13 colonies, seeds of a new society. Across the Atlantic, Britain's 13 colonies in North America grew rapidly from the late 17th into the 18th century. Unlike the Caribbean, these colonies were settler societies with waves of migrants seeking land, opportunity, and religious freedom. From New England's Puritan communities to the plantation economies of the South, the colonies developed diverse social structures, often semi-independent in practice, despite formal ties to London. The colonies were part of Britain's mercantile network, exporting tobacco, timber, furs, and agricultural goods while importing manufactured products from Britain. But distance, geography, and demographics allowed them to develop their own political institutions. Town meetings, colonial assemblies, and charters fostered a sense of local identity and self-governance. By the mid-18th century, colonial elites were educated, wealthy, and often saw themselves as British subjects, but distinct ones, with their own interests. The frontier expanded westward, bringing colonists into conflict with indigenous nations and rival European powers, particularly the French. Colonial militias formed, fortifications were built, and a unique Anglo-American society emerged, one foot in the Old World, one in the New. Though still loyal to Britain, these colonies were not passive outposts. Their growing populations, economies, and political confidence would eventually clash with London's attempts to tighten control, a conflict that would explode in the next century. But for now, in the 18th century, the 13 colonies were thriving, representing a new type of British imperial project, one where subjects were not just ruled, but recreated Britain overseas. The 7 Years' War, Britain's first global victory. The 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763, is often called the first true world war. Fought across Europe, North America, the Caribbean, West Africa, and South Asia. It was the decisive conflict that transformed Britain from a maritime power into a global hegemon. The war pitted Britain and its allies against France and its allies, with theaters of conflict on nearly every continent. In North America, known as the French and Indian War, British regulars and colonial militias fought against French forces and their Native American allies for control of the Ohio Valley and Canada. Key victories, such as the capture of Quebec in 1759, broke French power on the continent. In the Caribbean, Britain seized profitable sugar islands from the French. Off the coast of West Africa, forts changed hands. And in India, the British East India Company clashed with the French and their local allies in a series of decisive battles, most famously at Plassey 1757, where Robert Clive's victory laid the groundwork for British dominance in Bengal. This was not merely a series of colonial skirmishes, it was a coordinated imperial campaign, made possible by Britain's naval supremacy. The Royal Navy blockaded French ports, cut off reinforcements, and transported troops globally with unprecedented speed and efficiency. Britain's ability to project power across oceans gave it a strategic advantage unmatched by any other nation. The Treaty of Paris 1763 ended the war in Britain's favor. France ceded Canada, withdrew from India except a few trading posts, and conceded significant territories elsewhere. Britain emerged with a vast global empire, but also with enormous war debts that would soon lead it to impose new taxes on its American colonies, setting in motion the next great imperial crisis. The 7 Years' War was thus both a triumph and a turning point, cementing Britain's place as a world empire while sowing the seeds of future rebellion. The American Revolution, losing the jewel. By the 1760s, Britain stood astride the world as the victor of the 7 Years' War, but victory brought enormous debts. To recover financially, Parliament imposed a series of taxes and trade restrictions on the 13 colonies, including the Stamp Act, 1765, and Townshend Acts 1767. To London, these were reasonable. The colonies should contribute to the cost of their defense. But to many colonists, this was an attack on their autonomy. Colonial elites, used to a high degree of self-rule, rallied around the slogan, "No taxation without representation." Protests escalated. Boycotts, riots, and ultimately bloodshed at events like the Boston Massacre 1770. In 1773, the Boston Tea Party became a symbol of open defiance. Britain responded with harsh measures, the coercive acts, which only inflamed tensions further. The conflict exploded into war in 1775 at Lexington and Concord, as colonial militias clashed with British regulars. What began as a dispute over governance became a full-scale war for independence. The colonies declared independence in 1776, and with French, Spanish, and Dutch support, the conflict became global. Despite battlefield successes, Britain could not suppress a determined, widespread rebellion thousands of miles away. Supply lines stretched thin, public support in Britain wavered, and in 1781 the surrender at Yorktown sealed Britain's defeat. The Treaty of Paris 1783 recognized the United States' independence. Losing the American colonies was a shock to the British psyche. The empire had lost its jewel, but crucially, this was not the end. Britain turned the setback into a strategic redirection, looking east and south for new opportunities. The Napoleonic Wars and imperial survival. Barely 2 decades after the American Revolution, Britain faced its greatest existential threat since the Spanish Armada, Napoleon Bonaparte's France. From 1793 to 1815, Britain fought in a series of wars that would determine the fate of Europe and its empire. Britain's naval supremacy was the key. The Battle of Trafalgar, 1805, Admiral Horatio Nelson destroyed the combined French and Spanish fleets, ensuring Britain's control of the seas. This allowed Britain to blockade Napoleon's Europe, disrupt French colonial ambitions, and expand its own global reach while its armies fought on the continent. During the wars, Britain seized strategic colonies from its rivals. The Cape Colony, South Africa, was taken from the Dutch to secure the route to India. French possessions in the Caribbean and Indian Ocean were captured. British India expanded dramatically, as the East India Company used the distraction of European wars to consolidate its power across the subcontinent. The wars also transformed Britain domestically. Financing a 20-year conflict required an unprecedented mobilization of resources, creating a modern fiscal military state. Britain emerged from the Napoleonic Wars exhausted but triumphant, the only major power left unbroken. Its empire now stretched across strategic maritime choke points, from Gibraltar to the Cape to India, positioning Britain as the global naval hegemon for the next century. Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, settler societies. While wars raged in Europe, Britain began to shape a new kind of imperial frontier, one centered on settlement rather than trade or conquest. After losing the 13 colonies, Britain looked to Canada and the Pacific for spaces to export population, culture, and institutions. In Canada, British rule expanded after the defeat of the French. Loyalists fleeing the American Revolution settled in large numbers, shaping English-speaking communities that coexisted uneasily with French Canadians. Over time, Canada developed responsible government and became a model for gradual self-governance under imperial oversight. Meanwhile, the colonization of Australia began with the First Fleet in 1788, initially as a penal colony to relieve Britain's overcrowded prisons after the loss of American colonies. Convicts, soldiers, and administrators carved out settlements in a harsh and alien land, often clashing violently with indigenous Australians. By the early 19th century, free settlers began arriving, and Australia developed into a distinct settler society, tied economically to wool exports and politically to Britain. New Zealand followed later, with missionaries and traders arriving in the early 19th century, culminating in the Treaty of Waitangi, 1840, through which Britain claimed sovereignty. These colonies were unlike Caribbean plantations or Indian presidencies. They were extensions of Britain itself, where British law, language, and institutions were transplanted wholesale. Rebuilding after America, focus on Asia and Africa. The loss of America forced Britain to rethink its imperial priorities. The 19th century dawned with Asia and Africa at the center of imperial attention, the East India Company. Emboldened by military victories like Plassey 1757 and Buxar 1764, expanded its control across India. By the early 1800s, it had become the de facto ruler of vast territories, governing millions and extracting enormous wealth. In Africa, British activity was still mostly coastal, focused on forts, trade posts, and strategic naval bases. But control of places like the Cape Colony positioned Britain to dominate maritime routes. Between Europe and Asia, naval bases in Sierra Leone and St. Helena also became crucial anti-slavery and resupply points. In Southeast Asia, Britain secured Penang, 1786, Singapore, 1819, and other key ports that became part of the future Straits settlements. These were not yet vast colonies, but nodes in a global trade network, designed to control maritime choke points and ensure British commercial dominance. This eastward shift was deliberate. Britain realized that its future wealth and influence lay in controlling Asian trade, not clinging to lost American colonies. By investing in India's administration, maritime supremacy, and key ports, Britain laid the foundation for the Victorian imperial century to come. Industrialization and the empire's economic power. The late 18th and early 19th centuries saw Britain undergo a transformation more profound than any military conquest: the Industrial Revolution. Coal-powered factories, mechanized looms, steam engines, and railways turned Britain into the workshop of the world. But this revolution was deeply intertwined with the empire. The empire provided raw materials: cotton from India and Egypt, sugar from the Caribbean, wool from Australia, and in return, British factories flooded global markets with cheap manufactured goods. The Royal Navy ensured safe trade routes, while colonies served as both suppliers and consumers, locking them into Britain's economic orbit. Industrialization also gave Britain unprecedented military and naval capabilities: ironclad ships, efficient logistics, and the ability to project power over vast distances. It allowed Britain to outcompete older empires like Spain and Portugal, and to challenge rising powers like France and Russia. This economic transformation reinforced Britain's imperial ambitions. The empire was not just a political structure. It became the circulatory system of global capitalism, with London as its beating heart. Industrialization made Britain rich beyond precedent, but it also tied the empire's fate to global markets, making future crises all the more consequential. Abolition of the slave trade and its global impact. In 1807, After decades of activism by abolitionists like William Wilberforce, the British Parliament abolished the slave trade. By 1833, slavery itself was abolished across most of the empire. This marked a moral and political shift with global repercussions. Britain, once the world's largest slave trader, now became the self-proclaimed enforcer of abolition. The Royal Navy's West Africa Squadron patrolled the coasts, intercepting slave ships, freeing captives, and pressuring other nations to end their trade. This gave Britain a new moral justification for imperial expansion in Africa. Civilizing missions intertwined with strategic interests. The abolition movement also restructured labor systems in the Caribbean and elsewhere. Plantation economies shifted toward indentured labor from India and China, creating new diasporas. Britain's abolitionist stance became part of its global identity. Even as it continued to benefit economically from systems of exploitation and other forms, abolition didn't end imperialism, it reshaped it. By combining moral rhetoric with imperial strategy, Britain positioned itself as both global policeman and economic hegemon, entering the Victorian era with a new ideological armor for its imperial project. Pax Britannica, the empire at its peak. The year is 1851, inside London's Crystal Palace. The Great Exhibition dazzled the world with displays of industrial power, exotic colonial goods, and imperial trophies. Britain was no longer merely a naval power or a trading nation, it was the central hub of a global system. After Napoleon's defeat in 1815, Britain emerged with no equal on the seas. This overwhelming naval dominance, coupled with rapid industrialization, allowed it to police the world's oceans, suppress piracy, and even unilaterally enforce policies like the abolition of the Atlantic slave trade. Historians call this period Pax Britannica, the British peace, not because there was no war, but because Britain held a kind of global referee status. The empire now covered vast territories: India, large parts of Canada, Australia, New Zealand, swaths of Africa, and a growing presence in Asia and the Pacific. London became the financial capital of the world. British banks financed railways in Argentina, telegraph cables under the Atlantic, and mines in South Africa. British insurance companies, shipping firms, and investors tied distant regions into a single economic web. For many Britons, this global dominance felt permanent, almost ordained. The empire's flag flew on every continent, and its language began its march toward becoming the world's lingua franca. Yet beneath this grandeur was anxiety. Maintaining such an immense network required constant attention. Local rebellions had to be suppressed, rival powers like France and Russia had to be monitored, and the logistical infrastructure had to keep pace with expansion. The British peace was not effortless. It was sustained by countless soldiers. Bureaucrats, traders, and missionaries scattered across the globe, often far from home, operating in lands they barely understood but sought to reshape in their image. The Raj, British rule in India. If London was the heart of the empire, India was its jewel. After the defeat of the Marathas and the consolidation of the East India Company's control in the early 19th century, British influence in India transformed from commercial dominance to direct governance. By 1857, tensions were boiling. The Sepoy Mutiny, known in Britain as the Indian Mutiny and in India as the First War of Independence, exploded. After years of cultural insensitivity, economic exploitation, and military grievances, when the rebellion was crushed, the British Crown took direct control, dissolving the East India Company and inaugurating the period known as the British Raj. The Raj was a colossal administrative project. Railways snaked across the subcontinent, telegraphs linked remote provinces to Calcutta and London, and canals and irrigation transformed agriculture. British officials often prided themselves on bringing modernity to India. Universities were founded, legal systems standardized, and English education promoted. But this modernity was never neutral. It privileged British interests, redirected Indian economies toward imperial goals, and dismantled traditional industries to make way for British goods. The famous example is Indian textiles. Once globally renowned, they were undercut by mass-produced cloth from Manchester. The Raj was also an ideological project. British administrators often saw themselves as paternal guardians over a supposedly backward civilization. Their policies were infused with Victorian moralism and a racial hierarchy that placed Europeans firmly at the top. Meanwhile, Indian elites found themselves navigating a complex landscape, some collaborating and thriving within the new order, others resisting or seeking reform from within. The Raj's legacy is a deep and lasting one. It reshaped India's economy, infrastructure, education, and politics in ways that reverberate to this day. Africa partitioned, the scramble for empire. While India was being consolidated, Africa became the next great imperial frontier. For much of the early 19th century, British involvement in Africa had been coastal, focused on the slave trade suppression, missionary stations, and trading posts. But by the late 19th century, technological advances like quinine, which allowed Europeans to survive malaria, steam-powered riverboats, and improved firearms, opened the African interior to conquest. This coincided with fierce European rivalries. France, Germany, Belgium, and Britain all raced to carve out territories. At the Berlin Conference of 1884–85, European powers sat around a table and quite literally drew lines across maps of Africa, dividing it without regard to local cultures or existing kingdoms. Britain's share of this scramble for Africa was vast. From Egypt and Sudan in the northeast to the Cape Colony and beyond in the south, the British sought to create a continuous line of control, famously imagined as a Cape to Cairo railway. British administrators negotiated treaties often under duress, sent in soldiers, and relied on chartered companies like Cecil Rhodes' British South Africa Company to expand their reach. In some areas, like Nigeria, indirect rule was practiced. Local rulers were co-opted to govern on Britain's behalf. In others, like Kenya and Rhodesia, settlers displaced indigenous populations and seized fertile lands. This partition of Africa had devastating consequences. Ancient kingdoms were dismantled, ethnic groups were divided by arbitrary borders, and economies were redirected toward the extraction of raw materials for British industries. Yet it was also during this period that resistance movements began to take shape, movements that would, decades later, fuel Africa's eventual decolonization. The scramble for Africa was both a display of imperial confidence and a sowing of future storms. Imperial culture, language, religion, and education. One of the most enduring legacies of the British Empire was cultural. Wherever the Union Jack flew, English spread first among colonial elites, then through schools, legal systems, and missionary efforts. By the late Victorian era, English had become the language of administration, from Lagos to Lahore, Sydney to Singapore. Missionary societies played a crucial role, building schools, translating the Bible, and promoting Christian values. They often saw themselves as civilizing forces, bringing literacy and religion to peoples they considered heathen. For many colonized peoples, learning English and converting to Christianity opened doors to education and bureaucratic positions, but it also created profound cultural dislocations. Education became a tool of both uplift and control. Colonial curricula emphasized British history, literature, and values, while local histories were sidelined or denigrated. In India, figures like Thomas Macaulay explicitly argued for creating a class of persons, Indian in blood and color, but English in taste, in opinions, in morals, and in intellect. This cultural imperialism was subtle, yet pervasive, shaping generations who would both serve the empire and later lead movements against it. Religion, too, was a powerful force. Missionaries often preceded colonial administrators, softening resistance and laying groundwork for British influence. In Africa and the Pacific, conversions spread rapidly, though often blended with local beliefs in complex ways. In some cases, Christian institutions became spaces for resistance, education, and later nationalism. The spread of British culture was not a simple one-way imposition. It was a dynamic, contested process that produced hybrid identities, tensions, and unexpected transformations. The Royal Navy, guardian of the seas. By the mid-19th century, the Royal Navy wasn't just a military force, it was the backbone of the British Empire. Its power allowed Britain to control trade routes, deter rival empires, and intervene almost anywhere in the world within weeks or months. Steam engines revolutionized naval logistics, freeing ships from dependence on the wind and making them faster and more reliable. Massive ironclads and later steel warships represented cutting-edge technology, funded by the industrial wealth pouring into Britain. Naval bases dotted the globe from Gibraltar and Malta to Aden, Singapore, Hong Kong, the Cape of Good Hope, forming a strategic chain that ensured British ships could refuel, repair, and project power across every ocean. The Navy was not only a war machine but also an enforcer of British policy. It patrolled the coasts of Africa to suppress the slave trade after 1807, capturing slaving vessels and liberating their human cargo, though often in harsh conditions. It intervened in China to secure British trading privileges during the Opium Wars, bombarded coastal forts and forced open ports. It safeguarded merchant shipping that carried goods from India, cotton from Egypt, gold from South Africa, and tea from Ceylon. The saying "Britannia rules the waves" was not mere poetry. It was a daily reality maintained by thousands of sailors, officers, engineers, and support crews. Life in the Royal Navy during the Victorian era was harsh and disciplined. Sailors faced grueling months at sea, disease, and the constant threat of combat or accident. But naval service also offered social mobility for some. A poor farm boy could rise through the ranks, learn skills, and see distant parts of the world. Officers were drawn from Britain's elite and naval academies, shaping a culture of hierarchy and duty. In many ways, the Navy functioned as the Empire's nervous system, connecting its far-flung limbs and ensuring that no colonial possession was ever truly beyond London's reach. Strategically, the Royal Navy's dominance also acted as a deterrent to Britain's rivals. France, Russia, and later Germany all invested heavily in naval programs to challenge British supremacy, but until the early 20th century, none could match the sheer scale and global reach of Britain's fleet. This dominance allowed Britain to maintain Pax Britannica without relying on vast standing armies, instead leveraging maritime supremacy to shape global events from the sea. Victorian science, exploration, and missionary zeal. The Victorian era was not only a time of imperial expansion, but also of insatiable curiosity. Explorers, scientists, and missionaries fanned out across the globe, often traveling together or in overlapping networks. Figures like David Livingstone ventured deep into the African interior, mapping rivers, documenting flora and fauna, and reporting back to an enthralled British public. Royal Geographical Society lectures were packed with audiences eager to hear tales of deserts, jungles, and distant peoples. These journeys were framed as heroic quests for knowledge, but they also paved the way for imperial conquest by identifying strategic resources, potential trade routes, and local power structures. Science played a key role in imperial administration. Botanists cataloged crops, leading to the transplantation of plants like tea to India and rubber to Malaya. Zoologists documented species that would fill Britain's museums, while medical researchers experimented with treatments that allowed Europeans to survive in previously deadly climates. Technologies like the telegraph, steamship, and railway shrank distances, making imperial governance faster and more centralized. Britain's empire was not just political, it was technological, scientific, and infrastructural. Missionary societies, often operating alongside explorers, saw themselves as moral agents of transformation. They built schools, translated the Bible into local languages, and sought to eradicate practices they deemed barbaric, such as sati in India or polygamy in parts of Africa. Their zeal was deeply rooted in Victorian religious conviction, but it also aligned with imperial goals, spreading. Christianity often weakened traditional power structures and created communities more receptive to British influence. Some missionaries genuinely advocated for the welfare of indigenous peoples, while others acted as cultural imperialists, undermining local traditions and identities. Back in Britain, the stories brought home by explorers and missionaries fed a powerful imperial imagination. Newspapers serialized adventure tales, museums displayed artifacts as trophies, and the public embraced a vision of empire that was both moral crusade and thrilling frontier. Science and faith, exploration and conquest, curiosity and control, all were intertwined in the Victorian imperial project, giving it both intellectual justification and popular enthusiasm. Colonial administrations, governors, bureaucrats, and locals Running a global empire required more than soldiers and ships. It needed a vast machinery of governance. At the top were colonial governors, appointed by London to oversee territories ranging from sprawling dominions like India to tiny islands in the Caribbean. These governors wielded immense power, often acting as the king's representative. Chief diplomat and military commander rolled into one. Beneath them were legions of bureaucrats, district officers, magistrates, clerks, many of them young British men, educated in elite schools, sent abroad to administer lands they had only read about in geography books. Colonial administrations varied widely depending on the region. In settler colonies like Canada or Australia, local legislatures and European settlers held significant sway, often negotiating with London over autonomy. In territories like India or much of Africa, direct rule was the norm. British officials created hierarchies that placed themselves at the apex, often co-opting local elites as intermediaries. This system of indirect rule, popularized by figures like Lord Lugard in Nigeria, allowed Britain to control vast populations with relatively few administrators by co-opting traditional rulers and turning them into agents of empire. Administration was both rigid and improvisational. Formal bureaucracies existed on paper, but on the ground. Governance often depended on personal networks, improvisation, and the character of individual officers. Corruption, arrogance, and cultural misunderstandings were common, but so too were instances of genuine reformist zeal. Some administrators saw themselves as modernizers, building schools, courts, and infrastructure. Others ruled harshly, prioritizing extraction and control over welfare. Crucially, local populations were never passive in this process. From India's princely states to African kingdoms, indigenous leaders negotiated, resisted, collaborated, or adapted to the imperial system in myriad ways. Colonial administration was less a monolithic machine than a constantly shifting web of power relations, shaped by personalities, geography, and local politics. It was through this machinery that Britain maintained its global reach, often ruling millions with surprisingly few boots on the ground. Everyday life in the empire, from London to Lagos. While governors and admirals shaped policy, the empire's reality was lived daily by millions, both in Britain and across its colonies. In London, imperial wealth manifested in tea on breakfast tables, cotton garments from India, sugar and tea, and tropical fruits in markets. The rhythms of everyday life were infused with the empire's products, though most Britons rarely thought about the distant labor that made it possible. Magazines, advertisements, and school books painted the empire as a benevolent force bringing civilization to the world. A narrative that justified the system, even for those far removed from its machinery. In the colonies, life varied dramatically by race, class, and geography. British officials and settlers lived in segregated enclaves, often in grand houses with servants, trying to replicate British social customs under foreign skies. Clubs, cricket fields, and Anglican churches became miniature versions of home. Meanwhile, indigenous populations navigated new social hierarchies. Some entered colonial schools, took bureaucratic jobs, or became intermediaries. Others were displaced, exploited, or marginalized. Colonial cities like Calcutta, Lagos, and Cape Town became cosmopolitan spaces where languages, cuisines, and cultures mixed in complex and often unequal ways. For soldiers, traders, missionaries, and sailors, empire meant mobility, sometimes voluntary, often coerced. A young clerk might spend decades cycling through postings across Africa and Asia. Missionaries might raise families in remote outposts. Soldiers could fight in campaigns thousands of miles from home, bound by loyalty to a distant crown. For colonized peoples, empire meant new opportunities and devastating disruptions alike. Railways brought jobs, but also reshaped economies. English education offered advancement, but eroded local traditions. Back in Britain, empire was both distant and intimate. It was in the tea kettle, the school map, the novels of adventure, and the patriotic songs sung by children. It was a source of national pride and economic sustenance. For millions in the colonies, however, it was a lived reality of negotiation, adaptation, resistance, and survival. Everyday life in the empire was not uniform. It was a patchwork of experiences shaped by power, culture, and circumstance. The Boer Wars, conflict in southern Africa. As the 19th century drew to a close, Britain faced one of its most stubborn and costly colonial conflicts, the Boer Wars in southern Africa. The Boers were descendants of Dutch settlers who had migrated inland from the Cape Colony to establish their own republics, the Transvaal and the Orange Free State. Fiercely independent, deeply religious, and skilled in guerrilla tactics, the Boers resented British encroachment on their lands. Tensions escalated after the discovery of gold and diamonds in the region, attracting British interests and settlers eager to control the wealth beneath Boer soil. The First Boer War 1880–1881 was a shock to British confidence. Expecting an easy victory, Britain was instead defeated at battles like Majuba Hill, forced to recognize Boer autonomy. But the real storm came in 1899 with the Second Boer War. Determined not to be humiliated again and to secure control over South Africa's mineral wealth, Britain launched a full-scale invasion. The Boers, outnumbered but determined, waged a guerrilla campaign across vast territories, harassing British supply lines and ambushing columns. To crush the resistance, the British employed scorched earth tactics, burning farms, destroying crops, and interning Boer civilians in concentration camps. Tens of thousands, including women and children, died in these camps from disease and malnutrition, sparking outrage at home and abroad. It was one of the first modern conflicts to be heavily covered by the press, and British public opinion was bitterly divided between imperialists and critics. Eventually, through overwhelming force and systematic occupation, the British triumphed in 1902. The Boer republics were annexed, paving the way for the creation of the Union of South Africa in 1910, a dominion that would occupy a complex place within the empire. The Boer Wars revealed both the might and the vulnerability of the British Empire. Militarily, Britain could project enormous power across continents, but it struggled against determined local fighters using unconventional tactics, a foreshadowing of future colonial struggles. Politically, the war exposed deep rifts at home between liberal critics and imperial hardliners. It marked the beginning of a more self-aware, and at times uneasy, imperial age, as the myth of effortless British supremacy began to fray. The Great War, Empire at War. When Britain entered World War I in 1914, the entire empire was dragged into a global conflict unprecedented in scale. The Royal Navy blockaded Germany, colonial troops were mobilized from across the globe, and the empire's vast resources were harnessed to sustain the war effort. Over 1 million Indian soldiers served on fronts from Flanders to Mesopotamia. Australian and New Zealand forces fought at Gallipoli. Canadian troops gained a fierce reputation in battles like Vimy Ridge. African porters and soldiers supported campaigns in East Africa and beyond. This was not just Britain's war, it was an imperial war. The empire's contribution was staggering. Colonial economies shifted to support the war. Indian factories produced munitions, Egypt provided cotton and labor, and Canadian farms sent wheat to feed Britain. Troops traveled thousands of miles to fight in a war that was often far removed from their own national concerns. Motivated by loyalty, coercion, or the hope of political concessions afterward. Propaganda portrayed the empire as a family, united in defense of civilization, a powerful but selective narrative that masked the realities of colonial inequality. The war also had a transformative effect on colonial societies. Soldiers who fought in Europe returned with new political awareness, having experienced both camaraderie and discrimination. Promises made by Britain to colonial subjects, greater self-government,
recognition,
or reform, often went unfulfilled, sowing seeds of resentment. Meanwhile, the strain of total war exhausted Britain economically and socially. Though victorious in 1918, Britain emerged weakened, its debts soaring, and its aura of invincibility dimmed. The Great War marked a turning point. The empire had reached its greatest territorial extent, but beneath the surface, cracks were widening. Nationalist movements were gaining momentum in India, Ireland, and parts of Africa. The war had shown both the utility of empire in wartime and the unsustainable costs of maintaining such a vast, unequal system in a rapidly changing world. Interwar years, rising nationalism and strain. The period between the two world wars was a time of deep change and growing tension for the British Empire. On paper, it was still the world's largest empire, covering a quarter of the globe. But economic depression, shifting ideologies, and resurgent nationalist movements made the empire increasingly difficult to manage. The 1919 Amritsar massacre in India, where British troops fired on unarmed civilians, became a rallying cry for independence. In Ireland, the War of Independence led to the creation of the Irish Free State in 1922, showing that the empire could indeed be forced to retreat under pressure. Economic strains deepened the crisis. The Great Depression of the 1930s crippled global trade, undermining Britain's ability to sustain its imperial networks. Colonial economies suffered as demand for raw materials collapsed, leading to unrest in places like the Caribbean and West Africa. Britain introduced imperial preference trade policies to bolster economic ties, but these measures were only partially effective and alienated free trade advocates. Meanwhile, anti-colonial intellectuals and activists, often educated in British institutions, began articulating sophisticated critiques of empire. From Gandhi's nonviolent resistance to African nationalist leaders' calls for self-determination. The interwar years also saw the rise of new global powers. The United States and Japan challenged British economic dominance, while fascist Italy and Nazi Germany openly sought to dismantle the old imperial order. Britain tried to adapt, granting limited autonomy to some dominions, while cracking down on dissent elsewhere. It was a delicate balancing act, reforming enough to maintain control, but not enough to satisfy growing nationalist aspirations. By the late 1930s, Britain's empire was both vast and fragile. The illusion of permanence remained, but events in Ireland, India, and beyond signaled a new era of political awakening. The empire was no longer an unchallenged global colossus. It was a complex, strained system trying to hold back the tide of change. World War II, the empire's final test. World War II tested the British Empire like nothing before. When Britain stood alone against Nazi Germany in 1940, its empire became both shield and sword. Troops from India, Africa, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand rushed to support the war effort. Indian soldiers fought in North Africa, Burma, and Italy. African soldiers defended key colonial outposts. Australian and New Zealand forces stood alongside the British in Europe and the Pacific. The empire was mobilized on a scale even greater than in the First World War. Yet the war also accelerated imperial decline. The fall of Singapore in 1942, often described as Britain's worst military disaster, shattered the myth of British invincibility in Asia. Japanese forces swept through Southeast Asia, capturing British colonies and rallying local nationalist movements. The war drained Britain's finances to the brink of collapse. By 1945, it was heavily indebted to the United States, whose rise as a superpower signaled a new world order. Washington, though an ally, was skeptical of old empires and pushed for decolonization as part of its global strategy. Domestically, the war transformed British society. Bombings leveled cities, rationing reshaped daily life, and the shared struggle blurred old class lines. Colonies, too, experienced rapid change. Wartime demands led to industrial growth in India and Africa, and nationalist movements intensified as colonial subjects questioned why they were fighting for freedom abroad while being denied it at home. Britain emerged from the war victorious, but exhausted, militarily stretched, economically weakened, and facing a world that no longer accepted imperial domination as inevitable. World War II didn't end the British Empire overnight, but it marked the beginning of the end. The foundations that had sustained it for centuries were eroding under the pressures of war, nationalism, and changing global dynamics. The fall of Singapore and the empire's waning prestige. The fall of Singapore in February 1942 was more than a military defeat. It was a psychological earthquake for the British Empire. Singapore had been touted as the Gibraltar of the East, a fortress that symbolized British might in Asia. But when Japanese forces swept down the Malay Peninsula with astonishing speed, the British garrison surrendered after just a week of fighting. Over 80,000 British, Indian, and Australian troops were taken prisoner. Churchill called it the worst disaster and largest capitulation in British history. For the peoples of Asia, the fall of Singapore shattered a myth. If Britain could not defend its strongest base in the region, its claim to be the guardian of order and civilization rang hollow. Nationalist leaders across Asia took note. In Burma, India, and Malaya, movements gained momentum, some even collaborating with the Japanese in hopes of independence. The event also deeply shook Britain's dominions. Australia, feeling exposed, began turning toward the United States for protection, foreshadowing a realignment of global power. Militarily, the fall revealed Britain's strategic overreach and outdated assumptions. Its forces were ill-prepared for jungle warfare, its naval assets were stretched thin, and it underestimated Japan's capabilities. Symbolically, it marked the decline of Britain as the unchallenged imperial power in Asia. Even after the war ended, the psychological blow lingered. The age of unquestioned British dominance in the East was over. Singapore's fall was thus not just a single event, but a turning point, a visible crack in the edifice of empire that everyone, from colonial subjects to rival powers, could see. It set the stage for the wave of decolonization that would soon sweep through Asia and Africa, as Britain's prestige crumbled and its global position shifted irreversibly. Indian independence and the end of the Raj. By the end of World War II, India, the jewel in the crown of the British Empire, had become both its greatest asset and its greatest challenge. For nearly 2 centuries, British rule had shaped the subcontinent through economic exploitation, political restructuring, and cultural transformation. But the war had exhausted Britain, and India's nationalist movement had grown too strong to ignore. Led by figures like Mahatma Gandhi, Jawaharlal Nehru, Subhas Chandra Bose, and countless others, the push for independence had moved from the margins to the mainstream. Nonviolent resistance, mass protests, and strategic political mobilization had eroded the legitimacy of British rule from within. The Quit India movement of 1942 had shown the depth of nationalist sentiment even as Britain cracked down brutally. Meanwhile, the Indian National Army, aligned with the Japanese during the war, exposed the cracks in Britain's control over its own soldiers. By 1945, Britain's economy was on the brink of collapse. Sustaining a massive colonial presence was no longer viable. Prime Minister Clement Attlee's Labour government, more sympathetic to decolonization than its predecessors, recognized that maintaining the Raj through force would be both morally indefensible and strategically impossible. The path to independence, however, was far from peaceful. Deep religious divisions between Hindus and Muslims, intensified by decades of British divide and rule policies, erupted in violence. The hurried partition of British India in 1947 created the independent dominions of India and Pakistan, a monumental geopolitical shift that led to one of the largest mass migrations in history. Millions crossed new borders amidst chaos, and sectarian violence claimed hundreds of thousands of lives. The British withdrawal was swift, almost abrupt, signaling the end of one of the most powerful colonial administrations the world had ever seen. India's independence was both a triumph and a tragedy, a triumph for anti-colonial resistance, proving that empire could be dismantled by determined political movements, and a tragedy in the sense that the hasty exit left behind enduring wounds and unresolved tensions. For Britain, the end of the Raj marked the beginning of the end for the empire itself. The departure from India was not just a loss of territory, it was the loss of the imperial centerpiece, the economic and strategic anchor of British global power. African independence movements. While India's independence was the watershed, the wave that followed across Africa would fundamentally reshape the map of the British Empire. Africa had long been treated as a reservoir of resources and labor, rather than a center of political power. After World War II, however, nationalist movements began to surge, driven by returning soldiers, educated elites, trade unions, and cultural revivalists. The war had exposed the hypocrisy of colonial powers fighting for freedom abroad while maintaining domination at home. Britain, weakened and increasingly under international scrutiny, could no longer ignore the rising tide. The Gold Coast, modern Ghana, became the first sub-Saharan African colony to gain independence in 1957 under the leadership of Kwame Nkrumah, setting a precedent for others. Across the continent, movements grew, sometimes through negotiation, as in Nigeria and Sierra Leone, sometimes through bitter conflict, as in Kenya's MOWA uprising, where British forces responded with mass detentions and brutal counterinsurgency tactics. In Central and Southern Africa, settler communities complicated the path to independence, leading to tense transitions in places like Rhodesia, Zimbabwe, and South Africa, where apartheid would persist long after formal British rule ended. Britain's approach to decolonization in Africa was a mixture of pragmatism and reluctance. Unlike France's often violent resistance to independence, Britain generally pursued managed withdrawals, but these were shaped by its desire to maintain economic influence and avoid strategic chaos. Independence was often granted through constitutional conferences and negotiations. But colonial borders, drawn with little regard for ethnic or cultural realities, left behind fragile states that would face immense challenges after the Union Jack was lowered. The rapid decolonization of Africa in the late 1950s and 1960s is one of the most dramatic geopolitical transformations of the 20th century. In less than 2 decades, Britain went from controlling vast stretches of the continent to seeing an entire generation of new nations emerge. For Africans, it was the beginning of self-determination, though the legacies of colonial rule would cast long shadows. The Suez Crisis, a global humiliation. In 1956, Britain faced a reckoning that laid bare its diminished power. The Suez Crisis. Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser's decision to nationalize the Suez Canal, a vital artery for global trade and a symbol of British imperial prestige, triggered a secret military alliance between Britain, France, and Israel. The plan was simple. Israel would invade the Sinai Peninsula, giving Britain and France a pretext to intervene, ostensibly to protect the canal. In reality, it was an attempt to reassert old imperial control in the Middle East. Initially, the military operation went smoothly. British and French forces seized key positions. But the real blow came diplomatically. The United States, under President Eisenhower, was furious at not being consulted. Washington, now the world's dominant power, forced Britain and France to withdraw through economic pressure and diplomatic isolation. The Soviet Union also condemned the invasion, threatening intervention. Within weeks, Britain had to retreat, humiliated on the world stage. Suez marked the undeniable end of Britain's ability to act independently as a global imperial power. For many historians, the Suez Crisis is the symbolic end point of the British Empire as a superpower. It revealed that Britain's days of unilateral action were over. It now existed in a bipolar world dominated by the US and the USSR, at home. The crisis triggered soul-searching about Britain's role in the world. The old imperial swagger gave way to a more cautious, subordinate foreign policy, especially within NATO and its special relationship with the United States. For former colonies and the wider world, Suez sent a clear message. Britain was no longer the unchallenged empire it once was. Nationalist movements drew inspiration from Nasser's defiance. The crisis accelerated the decolonization process. As both Britain and France recognized that holding on to their empires was no longer sustainable in the face of global political realities, the winds of change. 1960s decolonization. In 1960, British Prime Minister Harold Macmillan delivered his famous Wind of Change speech in Cape Town, acknowledging the unstoppable force of African nationalism and the shifting global order. The 1960s became the decade when the British Empire unraveled at breathtaking speed. Dozens of colonies across Africa, the Caribbean, and Asia gained independence. Former imperial possessions like Nigeria, 1960, Tanganyika, and Zanzibar, which merged to form Tanzania, Jamaica, Trinidad and Tobago, and many others became sovereign states, often within the framework of the newly redefined Commonwealth. Britain's approach during this period was shaped by economic necessity, diplomatic calculation, and moral pressure. Maintaining colonies had become an expensive burden at a time when Britain was struggling. With post-war reconstruction and competing in a modernizing global economy, the United Nations and the superpowers increasingly viewed colonialism as incompatible with the New World Order. Rather than resist, Britain opted for relatively rapid, often negotiated transitions, aiming to leave behind pro-British governments and maintain economic influence through trade, investment, and cultural ties. This wave of decolonization was not without its challenges. Many new states inherited weak political institutions, arbitrary borders, and economies tailored to serve imperial interests rather than local development. Britain often departed quickly, leaving behind unresolved ethnic and political tensions that would later erupt into civil wars or authoritarian rule. Yet, for millions, the 1960s represented a moment of liberation. the end of centuries of foreign domination, and the beginning of national self-determination. By the end of the decade, the British Empire, as it had been known for centuries, no longer existed. What remained was a transformed relationship between Britain and its former colonies, one based less on control and more on diplomacy, trade, and shared history. The wind of change had swept through, leaving behind a new global landscape. The Commonwealth, reinventing influence. As the British Empire unraveled, Britain faced a pressing question. How could it maintain global relevance without direct imperial control? The answer emerged in the form of the Commonwealth of Nations, a voluntary association of former colonies, dominions, and territories united not by conquest, but by shared history, language, and often legal systems. Originating in the late 19th century as the British Commonwealth, the idea was gradually redefined during the mid-20th century as colonies gained independence. Rather than being a symbol of dominance, it became a platform for diplomatic cooperation and mutual benefit. In 1949, the London Declaration allowed republics like India to remain in the Commonwealth, signaling that allegiance to the crown was no longer a prerequisite. This flexibility transformed the association from an imperial club into a genuinely multinational organization. For Britain, the Commonwealth offered a way to project soft power through education. Cultural ties, trade agreements, and political forums, even as its military and territorial reach diminished. London became the site of regular Commonwealth Prime Ministers' conferences, where leaders from vastly different cultural and political backgrounds met on nominally equal footing. Throughout the 1950s, 70s, the Commonwealth played an increasingly important role in mediating post-colonial transitions. Britain used it to maintain influence in Africa and Asia without direct rule, encouraging the spread of parliamentary democracy and English legal frameworks. Institutions like the Commonwealth Games reinforced cultural links, presenting a shared identity that was less about empire and more about cooperation. Of course, critics argued that it was merely imperialism in softer clothing, a way for Britain to keep economic leverage while avoiding the responsibilities of governance. But for many former colonies, membership offered access to a broader international network and a symbolic connection to a shared past. Today, the Commonwealth remains a unique global entity, a group of over 50 countries, many of which have little in common beyond their historical relationship with Britain. Its endurance reflects both Britain's ability to adapt and the complex web of legacies, legal, cultural, and economic, that empire left behind. Though no longer a hegemon, Britain used the Commonwealth to reimagine its role on the world stage, trading gunboats for diplomacy. Post-imperial Britain, immigration, culture, and identity. The end of empire did not mean the end of imperial connections. In the decades following decolonization, Britain underwent a profound demographic and cultural transformation. Millions of people from former colonies migrated to Britain. Drawn by labor shortages in the post-war economy and by the legal pathways opened through imperial citizenship, from the arrival of the Empire Windrush in 1948, carrying Caribbean migrants, two waves of immigration from South Asia and Africa in the 1950s-70s, Britain became home to communities that had once lived under its rule overseas. This migration reshaped Britain's cities, economy, and culture. London, Birmingham, Manchester, and other industrial hubs saw the rise of vibrant multicultural neighborhoods, bringing new cuisines, music, languages, and traditions. South Asian workers became vital to the textile and transportation industries. Caribbean migrants staffed hospitals and public services. Britain's post-imperial identity was increasingly defined not by what it ruled abroad, but by the global communities within its borders. However, this transformation was not without tension. The 1960s and 70s saw rising anxieties about immigration, leading to restrictive legislation like the Commonwealth Immigrants Acts and heated public debates about Britishness. Racism and xenophobia surfaced through violent attacks and the rhetoric of far-right movements, while immigrants and their descendants asserted their place through activism, cultural expression, and legal challenges. This period forced Britain to confront its colonial past, not as distant history, but as a living legacy embodied in its population. Over time, the contributions of these communities became inseparable from Britain's national fabric. From music and fashion to politics and sports, post-imperial immigration transformed Britain into a multicultural society unlike anything in its imperial heyday. The empire had once sought to reshape the world in Britain's image. Now, Britain itself was being reshaped by the world it had ruled. The legacy of empire, modern debates and global impact. The British Empire officially ended decades ago, but its legacy is woven deeply into the modern world and into Britain's own national psyche. Across former colonies, imperial legacies are visible in legal systems, parliamentary structures, linguistic dominance, and even national borders. English has become the global lingua franca in no small part because of Britain's imperial expansion. Global financial networks and shipping routes still reflect the patterns set during the empire's peak. Yet, this legacy is far from universally celebrated. In Britain itself, debates over the empire have intensified in recent years. Some view it nostalgically, emphasizing perceived achievements like the spread of railways, governance systems, or trade networks. Others highlight the darker truths, exploitation, racial hierarchies, plunder, and the suppression of local cultures. Movements to decolonize education, remove statues of imperial figures, and reevaluate historical narratives have gained momentum. The empire is no longer a distant, glorified story. It is a contested memory, shaping contemporary political and cultural discourse. Internationally, the empire's legacy continues to influence geopolitics. Border disputes, economic inequalities, and political tensions often trace their roots to colonial boundaries and systems imposed by Britain and other empires. The Commonwealth itself reflects both enduring ties and unresolved power imbalances. Britain's post-Brexit foreign policy, for instance, has revived talk of a global Britain, drawing once again on historical relationships to forge new economic and diplomatic links. Ultimately, the British Empire was one of the most transformative forces in world history, not because it lasted forever, but because its echoes continue to reverberate. From the heights of Pax Britannica to the waves of decolonization and the complexities of modern multicultural Britain, its story is not a single narrative of triumph or tragedy, but a tapestry of ambition, exploitation, innovation, resistance, and enduring consequences. And so, we've journeyed through the entire history of the British Empire, from its medieval origins to its global dominance, its wars and crises, its dissolution, and its living legacy today. Few forces have shaped the modern world as profoundly as this empire. If you found this deep dive fascinating, make sure to like the video, subscribe for more epic historical explorations, and hit the bell icon so you never miss a new release. Comp a comment below. What part of the empire's history surprised you the most? The story of empire may have ended, but its echoes are everywhere.